The Vietnam War, one of the most brutal and controversial wars in modern history. A war that lasted nearly 20 years, claimed millions of lives, and changed the course of global politics forever. For decades, the world has been told that the US lost Vietnam, that it was a failure, a military disaster. But what if that's not the full story? What if America's real victory didn't come in the jungles of Vietnam, but decades later, on the world stage? The hidden strategies, the secret operations, and the untold truth. This is how the United States actually won the Vietnam War. The world remembers Vietnam as America's greatest failure. But was it really? To understand the truth, we need to look beyond the battlefields and ask a key question. What was America's real objective? The Vietnam War wasn't just about Vietnam. It was about stopping the spread of communism, the single greatest threat to US global dominance during the Cold War. In the 1950s, communism was spreading across Asia. China had fallen. North Korea was a Soviet ally. The Soviet Union itself was expanding its influence across Europe and Asia. The US feared that if South Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would collapse under communist rule. The so-called domino effect. So America intervened not to conquer Vietnam, but to contain communism. And on that front, the war played out very differently than most people realize. Let's talk about military power. The US brought overwhelming force to Vietnam. Over 2.7 million Americans served in the war, and the US spent an estimated $168 billion, equivalent to nearly $1 trillion today. The US had total air superiority. Operation Rolling Thunder, one of the largest bombing campaigns in history, dropped over 850,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, more than in all of World War II combined. North Vietnam's supply routes were destroyed. Their infrastructure was decimated. The war forced them into a brutal guerrilla conflict, draining their resources and manpower. On land, the US faced a guerrilla war, but in the skies and at sea, America dominated. The Tet Offensive in 1968 is often seen as a turning point in the war. In a massive surprise attack, the North launched coordinated strikes on over 100 cities, including Saigon. It was one of the largest battles of the war. The media portrayed it as a US defeat, but the truth was very different. The Viet Cong suffered over 50,000 casualties, nearly wiping out their forces. They had hoped for a South Vietnamese uprising, but it never happened. From that moment on, North Vietnam had no choice but to rely entirely on Soviet and Chinese aid to continue the war. While the war was fought in the jungles and skies, another war was happening in the shadows, the Phoenix program, a CIA-led operation designed to eliminate Viet Cong leadership and disrupt enemy networks. Over 80,000 Viet Cong operatives were either killed, captured, or turned into informants, making it one of the most effective intelligence operations in history. This wasn't just military warfare, it was psychological warfare. The Viet Cong became paranoid, unsure of who to trust. Their chain of command was shattered. By 1969, the American public had turned against the war. Nixon's solution? Vietnamization, a strategy to train and equip South Vietnam's army to take over the fight. By 1972, the US had withdrawn most troops, but left behind a heavily armed South Vietnamese military. They fought on their own for 3 more years, proving that the US hadn't just abandoned the war. So, if the US withdrew, how can we say it won? Because the Vietnam War wasn't just about Vietnam. It was part of a much bigger war, the Cold War. The Soviet Union and China poured billions into North Vietnam. The war drained their resources, slowed their expansion, and contributed to the Soviet collapse in 1991. In the end, communism didn't take over Southeast Asia. Vietnam itself is now a capitalist trading partner with the US. The Cold War was the real battlefield, and America won. Was Vietnam really a defeat? Or was it part of a bigger victory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.